twilight of the ancient world, when gods walked the earth and heroes were born of divine blood. A single apple would set in motion the greatest war ever known. The golden apple was no ordinary fruit. It was a gift, or a curse, from Eris, the goddess of discord, who had been slighted by the gods. When she was not invited to the grand wedding of Peleus and Thetis, she threw the apple among the guests with a simple inscription, "To the fairest." A hush fell over the divine assembly as the three most powerful goddesses, Hera, queen of the gods, Athena, goddess of wisdom, and Aphrodite, goddess of love, claimed it as their own. Zeus, father of gods and men, refused to judge between them. Instead, he commanded that the mortal Paris, prince of Troy, decide. Paris was a shepherd that day, tending his flocks on the slopes of Mount Ida. Each goddess approached him in secret, offering bribes no mortal man could resist. Hera promised dominion over the known world. Athena offered victory in every battle. But Aphrodite, with a voice soft as silk and eyes that burned with promise, promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta. Paris, young and captivated by the dream of love, gave the apple to Aphrodite. In that choice lay the seeds of ruin. Far away in Sparta, Helen lived in quiet splendor as queen to Menelaus. She was as radiant as dawn, her beauty whispered of in every land. And so it was that Paris traveled to Sparta, a guest of the king. When he looked upon Helen, the spell of Aphrodite took hold. She saw not a foreign prince, but a kindred spirit, and together they fled across the Aegean, stealing away in the dead of night. Back in Sparta, Menelaus awoke to betrayal, his queen gone, his honor stained. In fury and grief, he called upon his brother Agamemnon, the high king of Mycenae, and upon every king who had once sworn an oath to protect Helen's marriage. That oath would forge an alliance of Greek warriors, setting sail with 1,000 black ships to reclaim Helen and lay waste to Troy. The winds howled across the Aegean, carrying the scent of war. The news of Helen's abduction spread like wildfire across the kingdoms of Greece. From Mycenae to Ithaca, from Pylos to Argos. The kings who had once gathered at Helen's court remembered the oath they had sworn to defend her marriage and restore her honor no matter the cost. Menelaus, heartbroken and furious, stood before his brother Agamemnon, the high king of Mycenae. "Brother," he said, "our shame is not ours alone. Every king of Greece must honor his word, or he will be forever shamed in the eyes of the gods." Agamemnon, ambitious and resolute, saw in this war not only the chance to aid his brother, but also to expand his own glory. Messengers were sent to every corner of the Greek world, carrying the summons to war. Odysseus of Ithaca, cunning and wise, was reluctant to leave his young son and faithful wife. To avoid the call, he feigned madness, plowing his fields with salt. But the wily Palamedes exposed his ruse, and so Odysseus was bound to the cause. From Thessaly came Achilles, son of the sea nymph Thetis. Though his mother foresaw his early death in the war, Achilles was driven by an unquenchable thirst for glory. His armor gleamed like the sun, his presence alone a promise of victory. Nestor, the wise old king of Pylos, gathered his warriors, and Ajax the great, towering and steadfast, joined the ranks. Each brought his ships, his warriors, and his hopes for glory and vengeance. In Aulis, the Greeks assembled, 1,000 black-sailed ships bobbed upon the wine-dark sea, a testament to their power and resolve. But as they prepared to depart, the winds fell silent. The fleet lay trapped in the harbor, as if the gods themselves held them back. The seer, Calchas, eyes dark with the weight of fate, revealed the cause Artemis, goddess of the hunt, had been offended by Agamemnon's arrogance. To appease her, Agamemnon was told to sacrifice his own daughter Iphigenia. In the end, with tears of grief, Agamemnon relented. Iphigenia was led to the altar, her life a tragic price for the winds of war. As her blood touched the earth, the wind rose once more, filling the sails of 1,000 ships. The Greek fleet set out across the waves, the horizon dark with the promise of vengeance. In every heart burned the memory of Helen, and the knowledge that this war would shape the destiny of heroes and the will of the gods. The drums of war thundered across the Aegean, and the shadow of Troy loomed ever closer. The journey across the Aegean was long and perilous, but at last the Greek fleet arrived on the shores of Troy. The sea glimmered with the light of dawn as the ships approached their black sails, like the wings of ravens. The Trojans watched from their mighty walls. Priam, the old king of Troy, stood atop the ramparts, his heart heavy with dread. By his side stood Hector, the city's greatest warrior, steadfast and noble, and Paris, whose love for Helen had brought this storm upon them all. As the Greeks leaped from their ships, the first clash of bronze and iron shook the sands. Spears flew, and shields splintered as the two armies met in a thunderous roar of war. Achilles led the charge, his bright armor cutting through the morning light, a beacon of fury and skill. Behind him came Ajax, immense as a mountain, and Odysseus cunning in battle as in council. The Trojans too fought with valor. Hector's spear found its mark again and again, while Aeneas, noble prince of Dardania, stood firm at his side. Paris, though burdened by guilt, loosed arrow after arrow from the city walls. For days the fighting raged, the beach becoming a battlefield of blood and broken bodies. The Greeks built their camp by the sea, fortifying it with wooden palisades and trenches. Every night the fires of both camps glowed like constellations on earth. Yet even as the siege began, it was clear Troy would not fall easily. Its walls were tall and unyielding, said to have been built by the gods themselves. The Greeks could not breach them by force alone. The war became one of raids and skirmishes, of feints and feasts as the years crept by. 9 long years passed. The Greeks burned the towns of Troy's allies, cutting off the city's strength. But Troy itself stood firm, and in its streets life continued. Children played, old men prayed, and the songs of the past were whispered on the wind. But in the hearts of both Greeks and Trojans, a sense of doom took root. For though the war ground on without end, every man knew that the gods watched closely, and that the fate of Troy, and of every hero, was being written in the stars. Amid the endless battles that stained the plain of Troy with blood, there came a day when a pause was called. The sun rose clear and calm, and a hush fell over both armies. For on this day, Paris and Menelaus would face each other in single combat, hoping to end the war in one final duel. The challenge was simple. If Paris won, he would keep Helen and bring peace to Troy. If Menelaus won, Helen would return to Sparta, and the Greeks would go home. The armies gathered in a great circle on the dusty plain, their spears planted in the earth like a silent forest of death. Paris emerged from the Trojan lines clad in shining bronze, his face pale but resolute. Menelaus stepped forward from the Greeks, his eyes cold with fury, his heart burning with the memory of betrayal. The two men circled each other, their shields raised high. The clash of their bronze echoed across the plain as they traded blow after blow. Menelaus fought with the strength of a man wronged, his rage driving him forward. Paris, though skilled, could not match the fury of the Spartan king. At last Menelaus brought his sword down in a mighty stroke, shattering Paris's shield and knocking him to the ground. He grasped Paris by the crest of his helmet, ready to end the prince's life, then and there. But Aphrodite, goddess of love and protector of Paris, would not allow her chosen to fall. In a swirl of divine mist, she snatched Paris away from the battlefield, carrying him back to his chambers within the city walls. Menelaus stood alone, his sword poised to strike empty air. The Greeks roared in outrage at the treachery of the gods, while the Trojans gave thanks for their prince's escape. The truce was shattered. Bitterly disappointed, the Greeks returned to their lines, their anger redoubled. Once more, the clash of spears and the cries of the dying filled the air, and the war resumed its endless course. In the quiet of the night, Paris lay in Helen's arms, his heart heavy with shame and relief. And Helen, torn between love and guilt, wept for the price that all would pay for the choice she had made. As the war ground on, the Greeks faced a bitter struggle, not only against the walls of Troy, but also within their own camp. At the heart of this turmoil was Achilles, greatest of the Greek warriors, and Agamemnon, the high king, whose pride rivaled that of any mortal. It began when the Greeks captured Chryseis, the daughter of a priest of Apollo, and Agamemnon claimed her as his prize. Her father Chryseis came to the Greek camp with rich gifts, begging for his daughter's return. But Agamemnon, in his arrogance, refused. Chryseis prayed to Apollo, and the god answered. A plague swept through the Greek camp, a burning fever that struck down warriors and slaves alike. The cries of the dying filled the night, and the seer Calchas revealed the cause Apollo's wrath would not cease until Chryseis was returned. Agamemnon relented, but his pride demanded another prize. He turned his gaze upon Briseis, the captive of Achilles, and ordered her to be taken. Achilles' fury was like a storm. "You dishonor me," he roared. "I have fought your battles, I have shed my blood, and you repay me with this theft." In his tent, Achilles withdrew from the war, his armor set aside, his heart black with anger. Without him, the Greeks faltered. The Trojans, led by Hector's unyielding strength, pressed the attack, driving the Greeks back to their ships. Achilles watched from afar, his spirit torn between pride and the call of battle. Patroclus, his dearest friend, came to him, begging him to return. "The Greeks need you," he said. "Without you, we will fall." But Achilles would not be moved. "Let them see how they fare without me," he replied, his voice as cold as the bronze of his spear. "Let them taste the consequences of Agamemnon's arrogance." Outside the walls of Troy, the tide of battle shifted. The Trojans pushed closer to the Greek ships, and the fires of war burned brighter. But in the tent of Achilles, there was only silence, the calm before a storm that would soon break with fury. With Achilles' absence, the Greek camp was weakened, and the Trojans seized their chance. Each day, Hector led his warriors out from the city's gates, a spear of iron, and will that pierced the Greek lines again and again. The Trojans advanced like a tide of bronze, their shields glinting in the sun, their war cries echoing across the plain. Hector, clad in shining armor, was everywhere at once, his spear striking down champions, his voice lifting the spirits of his men. The Greeks tried to rally. Ajax, towering and resolute, fought like a wall of stone. Odysseus, ever cunning, devised traps and ambushes to slow the Trojan advance. But without Achilles, they could not turn the tide. One morning, as the sun rose red as blood, Hector led a charge that shattered the Greek lines. He drove them back to the very edge of the sea where their black ships lay beached. The Greeks built barricades of wood and earth, desperate to protect their last refuge. The battle raged at the gates of the Greek camp. Hector's chariot thundered across the field, his spear flashing like lightning. In the heart of the melee, he met Ajax in single combat, a clash of titans that shook the earth. Spears, splintered shields cracked, and neither would yield. As the sun set, the two champions drew back their bodies weary, but unbowed. The Greeks had held the line for another day, but their spirits were fading. In the night, the fires of the Trojan camp burned bright, and songs of triumph rose above the walls of Troy. In the palace, Priam embraced his son, his heart full of pride. "You are the shield of our city," he said. "So long as you stand, Troy will never fall." But even as they celebrated, the gods watched in silence, weaving the threads of fate ever tighter around them all. As the war thundered on, the Greek spirits grew ever darker. Each day brought new losses, and the song of victory was sung only in the halls of Troy. In the tent of Achilles, the silence was heavy as stone. Though the clash of bronze echoed beyond the walls, Achilles sat apart, his pride unyielding. But Patroclus, his dearest friend and companion, could bear the ruin of their people no longer. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, he came to Achilles with tears in his eyes. "My friend Patroclus," said his voice raw with grief, "our brothers fall like autumn leaves. The ships burn, and soon there will be no home for us to return to. Let me take your armor. Let me lead the Myrmidons into battle in your name." Achilles looked upon his friend with sorrow and fear. "The armor may shield your body," he said, "but not your soul. The hand of fate is upon us all." Yet Patroclus would not be swayed. "If you will not fight, let me fight in your place. Let the sight of your armor drive fear into the hearts of Troy." With a heavy heart, Achilles consented. He helped Patroclus into his gleaming bronze, the armor he had worn in 100 battles. The Myrmidons gathered around their false Achilles, their spirits lifted by the promise of vengeance. At dawn, the gates of the Greek camp burst open. Patroclus led the charge, the Myrmidons at his back, like a wave of black iron. The Trojans faltered at the sight of Achilles' armor, their lines breaking before the fury of the Myrmidons. Patroclus fought like a man possessed his spear, striking true, his shield unbroken. He drove the Trojans from the ships, the fires of destruction quenched by his courage. Even Hector fell back before him, the prince of Troy, uncertain for the first time. Yet in his heart, Patroclus knew he was no Achilles. In the heat of battle, he pressed on, driven by hope and the weight of his borrowed glory. And in that hope lay the seeds of tragedy. The fury of Patroclus burned bright on the battlefield. His borrowed armor flashed in the sun, and the Trojans fell back before his relentless onslaught. For a time it seemed as though the tide had turned, that the Greeks would be saved by the courage of one man. But the gods watched from their high thrones, weaving the threads of fate with cold indifference. Zeus, moved by the prayers of Thetis, granted Patroclus great strength for a time. Yet even the greatest mortal cannot escape what is written in the stars. Patroclus pressed his advantage too far. In the heat of his triumph, he scaled the walls of Troy's allies and struck down their champion Sarpedon, son of Zeus himself. The earth drank the blood of heroes that day, and the gods wept as the mortal world burned. In his pride, Patroclus pursued the Trojans to the very gates of Troy. There he met Hector, prince of the city and bulwark of its walls. The two warriors faced each other in the dust, the roar of the battle fading as all watched. Patroclus fought with all his heart, but Hector was the stronger. His spear found the gap in the borrowed armor, and with a final cry, Patroclus fell to the ground. As his life ebbed away, he spoke words of prophecy. "Hector, even you will not escape. Achilles will come for you." Hector stood over the fallen warrior, his brow dark with sorrow and triumph. He stripped the shining armor from Patroclus's body, claiming it as his prize, and with it, the wrath of Achilles. The Greeks carried the broken body of Patroclus back to their camp, their hearts heavy with grief. In his tent, Achilles waited. And when he saw his friend's lifeless form, his cry of anguish shook the very earth. For now the war was no longer for Helen, nor for the pride of kings. It was for the soul of Achilles, and for the vengeance that would soon consume them all. The death of Patroclus shattered the fragile calm within Achilles' heart. The tent that had been his refuge became a tomb of grief. He knelt beside his friend's lifeless body, tears of fury and sorrow streaming down his face. He called upon his mother, the sea nymph Thetis, her shimmering form rising from the waves. She held him as he wept, and her voice was a balm in the darkness. "My son," she said, "I have always known this war would take you, but now you must embrace your fate. Let me go to Hephaestus, the smith of the gods, and he will forge you armor worthy of your wrath." Thetis vanished into the depths, and soon she returned with armor of divine make. A breastplate that gleamed like the sun, a shield that held the whole world in its face, and a spear that sang of vengeance. Clad in this new armor, Achilles strode from his tent like a god of war. His eyes burned with a light that none could meet. The Greek army rallied at the sight of him, their spirits lifted by the return of their greatest champion. At dawn, he stood before the gates of Troy, his voice ringing out across the plain. "Hector, come forth and face me, for today one of us will feed the earth with his blood." The battle that day was like none that had come before. Achilles cut through the Trojan ranks like a flame through dry grass. His spear struck down princes and champions, his fury unrelenting. Hector watched from the walls, his heart steady, despite the dread that gripped his people. He knew that he could not hide that his honor and his love for Troy demanded he face this storm, and so he stepped forth. His armor glinting in the sun, his spear held high. The two greatest warriors of their age stood alone between the armies, the plain silent, but for the beat of their hearts. The plain of Troy fell silent, as Achilles and Hector faced each other, two champions standing at the edge of destiny. In the stillness, every eye watched, and even the gods paused to witness the final duel. Achilles' armor gleamed in the sun, his shield a world of swirling images. of ocean waves and blazing sun, of life and death entwined. Hector stood with steady resolve, his spear firm in his hand, his heart full of love for his city and his family. They circled one another in the dust, each searching for a weakness in the other's defense. With a sudden cry, Achilles lunged his spear, flashing like lightning. Hector parried and countered his movements, graceful and sure. The clash of bronze rang out like thunder, echoing off the distant walls of Troy. Again and again they struck, each blow fueled by pride and love by grief and the knowledge that only one would walk away. The dust rose around them, shrouding the duel in a haze of gold and crimson. Hector fought bravely, but Achilles was a storm that could not be stopped. With a final shattering thrust, Achilles' spear pierced the gap in Hector's armor. The Prince of Troy fell to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. As Hector's life slipped away, he spoke words of prophecy, Achilles. Your own death awaits you at these gates. But Achilles, lost in his fury, heard nothing. He stripped the armor from Hector's body and tied it to the back of his chariot. With the eyes of both armies upon him, he drove around the walls of Troy. The lifeless body of Hector dragged in the dust. The people of Troy wept from the battlements, Priam's cries echoing in the cold night air. But Achilles' wrath was a fire that could not be quenched. In the Greek camp, the warriors watched in silence as Achilles returned his face a mask of triumph and grief, for though Hector had fallen, the shadow of fate loomed large. And in the darkness, the gods turned their gaze elsewhere, for they knew the final tragedy had yet to come. In the quiet of night, the fires of the Greek camp burned low, their flickering light casting long shadows across the tents. Achilles sat alone, the weight of his fury and triumph heavy upon him. Before him lay Hector's body still and lifeless, bound by the ropes of his chariot. But in the city of Troy, an old man wept. King Priam, father of Hector, and ruler of Troy, felt his heart break with every breath. He could not bear the thought of his son's body desecrated, dragged across the earth like a prize of war. In his grief, Priam turned to the gods. Guided by Herm the swift messenger, he made his way through the dark plain to the Greek camp, unseen by mortal eyes. Dressed in simple robes, he carried with him no weapons, only the weight of his sorrow and the gold of his ransom. As he entered Achilles' tent, the air was heavy with silence. Achilles looked up, his eyes still bright with the embers of his rage. Priam fell to his knees, tears streaking his aged face. Achilles, he said, his voice trembling, I have come not as a king, but as a father. I beg of you, return to me the body of my son. Think of your own father, and let mercy temper your wrath. For a moment, Achilles' heart was a storm of anger and memory. But as he looked upon Priam, he saw not an enemy, but an old man who had lost everything. His own father Peleus was far away, and in Priam's grief he saw his own fate. Slowly Achilles reached out his hand and raised Priam from the ground. I will grant you this old king, he said softly. Take your son home. The body of Hector was washed and wrapped in fine linen, and with it, the Greeks laid aside their arms for a single night. As Priam carried his son's body back to Troy, the fires of war burned low, and for a moment there was peace. But in the shadows of the gods, the threads of fate still wove their unbreakable pattern, and the end of the war drew ever closer. Though the funeral fires of Hector burned bright, and the songs of mourning echoed through Troy, the war was far from over. For 9 long years, the Greeks had battered the city's walls to no avail. Now, weary of endless battle, they turned to guile. Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca, conceived a plan to bring down the walls of Troy, not with spear and shield, but with deception. "Let us build a horse of towering height," he said, "a gift to the gods, a token of our departure. But within its hollow belly, our bravest warriors will hide." The Greeks set to work with fevered purpose. Timber from the forests of Ida was shaped into the form of a mighty steed. Its flanks rose higher than the city walls, a monument of ambition and cunning. While some labored on the horse, others set fire to their camps and ships, a final act to convince the Trojans of their retreat. On the morning of the 10th year's end, the Greeks were gone. Only the great wooden horse remained silent and imposing on the blood-stained shore. From the walls of Troy, the people watched in wonder. Priam, weary of war and desperate for peace, ordered the gates opened. The Trojans poured out their voices, raised in triumph and disbelief. They danced around the horse, their laughter echoing across the empty plain. Only Laocoon, a priest of Apollo, warned them of treachery. "Beware the Greeks even bearing gifts," he cried. But his warning fell on deaf ears. Even as he spoke, 2 great serpents sent by the gods rose from the sea and devoured him and his sons, a terrible omen that none could deny. Believing it a sign of divine favor, the Trojans brought the wooden horse into their city. They feasted and drank late into the night, their songs of victory drowning out the whispers of doom. Inside the horse, Odysseus and the bravest of the Greeks waited in silence, their swords at the ready, their hearts pounding with the knowledge that before dawn the fate of Troy would be sealed. As night fell over Troy, the city glowed with the light of 1,000 torches. Songs of victory filled the air, and wine flowed like rivers. The Trojans believed the war was over, that the Greeks had fled, and the gods had smiled upon them. But in the silent darkness of the wooden horse, Odysseus and the bravest of the Greeks waited. Every breath was measured, every heartbeat, an echo of the fate that hung over them. At last, when the city was deep in wine-soaked slumber, Odysseus gave the signal. The hatch of the wooden horse creaked open. One by one, the warriors dropped to the ground, their bronze armor glinting in the moonlight. Stealthy as shadows, they moved through the sleeping city, cutting down the guards and opening the gates. Outside the walls, the Greek army had returned their ships hidden beyond the headland. With a roar that shattered the night, they poured into the city, orches and swords in hand. Troy woke to screams and fire. The narrow streets became rivers of blood as warriors clashed in the flickering light of burning homes. Priam's palace fell its marble halls, echoing with the cries of the dying. The old king himself was cut down at the altar of Zeus, his blood mingling with the ashes of his city. In the chaos, Aeneas gathered what remained of his family and fled the city, guided by the will of the gods to carry Troy's legacy to new lands. Helen, her beauty untouched by the years of war, stood on the walls of Troy as Menelaus found her. His heart was torn between love and rage, but in the end, he took her hand and led her away, a ghost of the queen he had once known. By dawn, the proud city of Troy was no more. Its towers crumbled, its people scattered or slain. The Greeks loaded their ships with plunder, the spoils of a decade of war. But in the eyes of every man who sailed home, there was no triumph, only the memory of fire and the shadow of a city that would never rise again. With the dawn of a new day, the Greek warriors began their long journey home. The black ships, heavy with treasure and memories of the war, slipped out across the wine-dark sea, leaving the smoking ruins of Troy behind. But for many, the journey was not a homecoming, but another trial. The gods who had watched the war with cold amusement now turned their eyes to those who had fought it. Some were granted safe passage, but others would wander the seas for years, haunted by the memories of all they had seen. Menelaus took Helen back to Sparta, their eyes haunted by the ghosts of the past, though she was his queen again. The love that had once burned between them was now but a flickering ember. Ajax, the great proud and fierce, met his end not in battle, but by his own hand, driven mad by the gods for his arrogance. Nestor, old and wise, returned to Pylos to tell tales of the war to those too young to fight. Odysseus, the wily king of Ithaca, found no peace on the sea. For 10 years, he wandered facing monsters and storms, his heart yearning for his wife and son. His journey would become a legend of its own, a tale of longing and endurance. And Achilles, the greatest of all the Greeks, had not lived to see the city burn. His death had come in the final days of the war, struck down by Paris with an arrow guided by the hand of Apollo. His mother Thetis wept for him, and his name would echo in the songs of poets for all time. As the ships disappeared into the horizon, the gods themselves looked down upon the world they had shaped. The age of heroes was ending, and a new world was rising from the ashes of Troy. The songs of the bards would remember the war, of love and pride, of fury and loss, but the world would move on. And so the sea carried the Greeks home, each wave a whisper of the city they had left behind. Long after the last of the black ships had vanished over the horizon, the echoes of Troy still haunted the world. On lonely shores and in great halls, poets sang of the war that had raged for a decade, of the heroes whose deeds had become legends. In the halls of the Greeks, old warriors sat by the hearth, their voices low and solemn as they told of the battles they had seen. In the marketplaces of Troy's allies, merchants spoke in hushed tones of the city that had once been the jewel of the East, now reduced to smoke and ashes. But for those who had walked its walls and fought in its shadows, the memory of Troy was more than song or story. It was a weight they would carry all their days. Odysseus, lost to the endless sea, found no peace in his wanderings. Each night the wind carried to him the scent of Troy's burning towers. In dreams he saw the face of Hector, the cries of Priam, and the endless dust of the battlefield. In Sparta, Menelaus and Helen lived as king and queen, but in the silence of the night she would sometimes weep her tears, a memory of a love that had brought ruin to empires. And in the halls of the dead, Achilles and Hector stood side by side, their rivalry and fury left behind. For in death all warriors find the same quiet, and all the glories of the world fade to whispers. Yet even as the centuries turned and the world moved on, the memory of Troy endured. It lived in the marble of ruined temples, in the quiet songs of shepherds, in the stars that watched over a sleeping sea. For Troy was not just a city of stone and walls. It was a story of love and wrath, of loyalty and betrayal, of the fleeting glory of heroes and the endless silence that comes after. And so the echoes of Troy would never truly fade. As long as there were those who sang its songs and whispered its name, the city would live on forever, a testament to the hearts of those who dared to dream and the price they paid for it.